In the pitch darkness of the ancient cave, drops of condensation fell from the ceiling to the ground, cutting the silence with a soft sound. Suddenly, the wounded man fell to his knees through groans and screamed in pain. His friend immediately picked up his partner and asked if he was okay. Then the man in the cloak said that they didn't have much time left. The wounded fighter asked to be released. Immediately afterwards, he again lost his footing and fell to the ground. Looking at this, the cloaked man said that there were already many people who had already fainted. The fighters ahead of them looked at the poor man. One of them said that the healers didn't have much mana left. However, the injured man suddenly cut into the conversation and said he was fine. Suddenly, he looked excitedly straight in front of him and said that the hope of the Empire was with them. That day, at the head of the squad was a tall man in shining armor, whom all the subordinates called Warrior Vern. The knight turned around and looked at the wounded soldier with a smile. He said that he was glad to hear his subordinate's voice, because it meant that he was all right. After the guy shouted out that he was feeling great, Vern turned away. It looked like the squad members were beginning to feel uneasy. At the very beginning, the conquest team under his leadership numbered 74 men. Now only 43 remained in the formation. This thought made the legendary knight become extremely nervous. Gathering his thoughts, he thought that in this situation, he could not stick to the idea that he had lost 31 fighters killed. He must now realize that 43 men had survived. Yet despite the fact that all these seasoned and experienced fighters tried their best, they lost so many valiant adventurers. Vern looked sadly at his feet. Their losses were too great after all. Then the knight raised his head and examined the stalactites overhanging them. He thought that, in spite of everything that had happened, the fighters had been prepared for this outcome from the beginning. At that moment, none of the squad expected any other option from facing one of the 7 great evils of this world. This dungeon contained something that had made mankind shudder for centuries. The squad's objective was the core of primordiality. Suddenly, one of the fighters called out to the thoughtful Vern. After the leader's question about what had happened, the knight pointed a finger in the direction the squad was advancing. They saw a passage of enormous dimensions. The people looked like the most pathetic ants against it. Vern tensed. More than anyone else, they were close to their goal. Right in front of them was the end of the dungeon, the core of primordiality. The group made an incredible effort and expended a lot of human blood to get to this place. In addition, according to numerous reports and legends, there is such a huge amount of treasure stored at the end of the dungeon that no king can imagine. In addition, one of the finest creations created by mankind, called the 36th masterpiece, is kept here. And it's all guarded by the mysterious owner of the dungeon. Suddenly, the strongest vibrations shook the ground beneath the adventurers' feet. Realizing that the decisive phase of the battle might now be upon us, Vern ordered the squad to fall into formation. Conventional battle tactics dictate that shields and swords should become the front, and the role of the mages is to light up the place and maintain a field of vision for the entire squad. The whole ceiling of the cave was shaking. It seemed as if sharp stone stakes were about to fly down on the soldiers. This did not happen, however, and soon, to general surprise, the vibrations ceased. One of the strongest wizards said that they had better make the lights brighter now. After that, he asked the squad to stay alert. Following him, several wizards also illuminated the space around them. When visibility improved, the squad was startled to see a silhouette of incredible size. Suddenly, the creature opened its eyes and looked at the uninvited guests. Then the vibrations resumed, and the ground beneath the traveler's feet began to crack. For the first time in his life, Warrior Vern experienced an incredible, almost animalistic fear. Suddenly, the terrifying creature opened its mouth, revealing several rows of enormous, bloody teeth. A few seconds before the end of the battle, Vern shouted the order to retreat. Some time after the described events, the enraged skeleton offered to summarize the described story. From the story, he realized that the monster was asleep when the humans burst in. In response, the creature, overcoming fatigue, coped with them without difficulty. After re-describing the story, the skeleton asked if he had missed something. The monster replied that he had. Then he cocked his head and said that he had an aggravating circumstance, as he had to fight against 2 opponents at once, humans and exhaustion. The dark entity then turned to Pedrick, who was beyond furious, and asked him to calm down. Unwilling to restrain himself, the skeleton shouted that he was incapable of holding himself together. Pedrick pointed his finger at the monster and said that he couldn't believe that he had been asleep when the men entered the dungeon. Gesticulating in various ways, the skeleton would not calm down, and shouted out a situation where a majestic creature described in numerous legends was yawning right in front of the pitiful humans. Pedrick was eerily pissed off at the situation, where the dark creature's mind and attitude was a big problem for them. He then pointed his hand at the boss again and looked away, and asked his partner named Rennie what she thought about all this. The girl said that she had never heard of any monster sweeping away an entire squad of people with just one yawn. She then looked at the monster called Mr. Eater with loving eyes and let out a shriek of shock at his incredible dignity once again. Seeing that this psychopath was once again not supporting him, Pedrick became even more nervous. The thought made his skull crack again. The skeleton thought that their community was turning into a madhouse. After that, Pedrick sat back in his chair and realized that it looked like it was time for him to just give up. He grabbed his head with his hands and shouted that the dungeon was about to end. The eater saw this and said that the skeleton shouldn't be so nervous, or his bones would rot. This was what one of the 7 great evils looked like, which had finally become impossible for humans to conquer. This was the core of the primordial universe. By that point, the passage of most dungeons ended in an unqualified victory for the humans. Knights and a wide variety of adventurers could attack monster hideouts at any time, putting opponents in an unfair position. Repeating battles time after time with incredible speed weakened the dungeons. Over many millennia, an endless number of new monster sanctuaries have been built and cleaned up. However, the existence of special dungeons beyond anyone's control was obvious. The shelters that are most famous are those that people have implicitly dubbed the 7 great evils. These are places humanity has found impossible to conquer. Among these infamous dungeons of great evil, the worst in the demon world was considered the core of primordial evil. Dozens of the strongest monsters guarded the many passages of this cave. The gatekeepers of the 3 crossroads awaited the adventurers before the finale. Over many years of trying, humanity had managed to gather enough information about these creatures. The red crossroads on the left was defended by a dagger handmaiden named Rennie. Defending the blue passageway in the center was a death knight, a skeleton named Pedrick. The most unexplored was the right passage, which was nicknamed the Dirty Passage. It was defended by unknown mysterious tentacles. In addition, after passing one of the crossroads, the ruler of this impregnable fortress was waiting for the adventurers at the end. It was the original monster from the first pages of Imperial mythology, and his name was the Devourer. Slamming the book shut, Rennie said it was all the important information about them. She then sat down and said that, as the master had predicted, there had been many more attacks since the distribution of this work. The eater patted his hand with a smile and told his subordinate that she should also learn how to manage the dungeon. The most important thing was to kick up some mystery, and people wouldn't even notice the catch. That's exactly how they should continue to spread the information. Then mankind will mistakenly think that they already have all the known information about the dungeon. This false confidence encourages them. So when people see half-fictional books, they flock to them like moths to a flame. And yet there was something that made the eater very wary. He admitted that he hadn't expected so many adventurers to flock here. He then looked at the bodies laid out to the side and asked how many men were in that squad. Rennie replied that there were 74 knights and mages. However, most of their equipment melted away when they fought against Mr. 116 Black Tentacles. Only the most expensive weapons survived this battle. After that, the girl huffed and said that if she had the chance to fight, she'd probably deal without damaging anything. The eater looked tiredly at his subordinate and replied that he didn't doubt it. After that, his body rapidly began to change shape and transform. A few seconds later, the dark matter left no trace of the monster's familiar form. Suddenly, a human eye appeared in the dark blob, looking directly at Rennie. Then, a dark hand appeared out of the matter and reached out to the girl. The eater, taking on human form, walked over to his subordinate and stroked her head. He said he had no doubt that she would have done much better. Rennie got embarrassed and laughed. However, this situation displeased Pedrick very much. He looked angrily at the monsters and asked if they were holding some kind of meeting here. The skeleton then glared angrily with his eyes and said that if they were just having fun now, why wasn't he laughing at all? Pedrick then spoofed the other 2 monsters in his favorite manner, saying that he was in a very good mood and that he had caught a cavity by breathing in some air. But then he shook nervously and shouted furiously that it was not just about his teeth, as his head would also rot sooner or later. After that, the skeleton looked at the boss and said that if he wanted to change form, he should do it appropriately. After all, when the guy stroked Rennie's head, he had as many as 6 fingers. When the Devourer thanked his subordinate, the skeleton laughed in response, saying that it was better than the last time the boss had over 40 teeth without seeing any problems. Pedrick's laughter made his bones crunch loudly. Rennie said that she just hated that sound as it made too much noise. Glaring furiously at the girl, the skeleton thought that it was time for her to quit her job as a dungeon protector if she's suddenly disgusted by such things. When everyone around them had more or less calmed down, Rennie said it was time for them to get down to business. All the monsters sat down at the round table. The girl noted that as of late, it had been noticed that people were finally starting to attack the right intersection. The main problem is that Mr. 116 Tentacles, who was protecting the area, was severely damaged during the attacks, and his condition is rated as extremely critical. After saying that, the Eater yawned and asked his subordinate not to worry about it, because the power of tentacle regeneration was beyond her consciousness. He added that otherwise, if things were really bad, they could find a new protector. Suddenly, Pedrick, hearing these words, asked his boss to look for 2 people for the role at once. He explained that he wanted to leave as well. The Eater surprisingly said that he didn't want to hear about it since the skeleton had a lifetime contract. The guy said that lately people only come to his right intersection at any given outcome. Pedrick agreed with the Lord, adding that a new squad was probably already organized to attack them. Rennie also picked up on the fact that people use telepathy magic as a means of communication, so news of the destruction at the dirty right intersection may have already spread. Hearing all these additions to the problem presented, the Eater pounded on the table and said that the situation had become clearer. He looked at his subordinates and said that they also needed to think about their defense during the next attack. Then the guy said that the 3 of them should switch positions. Looking at Rennie, Eater said that the girl who had been protecting the red path on the left would now take care of the messy intersection on the right. He explained that the attackers would break in there thinking it was safer, and then she would take them in. Hearing this, Rennie replied that she could stop any number of people from coming there. Then the Eater looked at Pedrick and said that he would take charge of the red intersection on the left. The skeleton was puzzled and asked why he was getting that role. The guy explained that those people who realize there's Rennie in the dirty intersection break into the red passage on the left where she usually dwelled, and then Pedrick could stop them there. This tactic would help them fend off at least the next 2 attacks. Suddenly, the skeleton asked the boss to stop and said that he had another question. He then asked what the gentleman was going to do if people headed to the blue intersection down the center. There was a tense silence at the table for a while. The Eater explained that in that case, those who risked trying to break through the center would have to settle for a date with him. Skeleton sighed and said that it was a very confused plan. However, all his arguments were interrupted by Rennie, who shouted that Mr. Eater had come up with a simply brilliant strategy. Seeing this, Pedrick thought that there was nothing he could do about it. Then the girl calmly sat back down and summarized that they had discussed the main agenda. Now they had to decide what to do with that sword. The tired Devourer asked what it was about. Pedrick replied that the girl was referring to the weapon the squad leader had used this time. The skeleton looked around and noted that these guys seemed to be very strong, carrying blades like that. The guy asked for a description of the weapon in question, and Pedrick said he was sure the boss had heard of it before. Wandering around the corpses, the skeleton found the hilt of the very same sword. Stepping over the bodies of the slain, he reached over and grabbed the hilt of his blade. Pedrick then swung the sword and said that it was the 36 masterpiece, which is an extremely famous weapon among humans. But suddenly, the skeleton realized that it was blade number 14, which is called Tannabella. The Eater scratched the back of his head lazily and said he remembered hearing about these 36 masterpieces before. He thought that there must be a few more of these things lying around in the corner of the vault. In addition, that unusual blade that Renee is using is also one of those masterpieces. Eater noted that the humans were using some pretty good weaponry. Pedrick said that if they gave that blade to those monsters at the entrance, the humans would take it back. In that case, they would have another headache to deal with. With that thought, the skeleton walked over to the Lord and handed him the masterpiece, telling him that the lad would have to take it for himself. The Eater said in surprise that Pedrick was using a sword, and it would probably be better for him to take the weapon for himself. At this generosity, the skeleton was taken aback for a moment and looked uncertainly into the Lord's eyes. He then asked again if it wasn't a joke, to which the boss replied that he didn't care about that piece of iron. After saying that, Pedrick laughed and caustically muttered that in that case, he had no choice because it was the boss's order. This is exactly what that legendary primordial core looks like from the inside. This place has become home to a terrifying homunculus maid and a death knight that exudes grave energy. With that thought, the tired eater fell face down on the table and said that in that case, Pedrick should tear up the letter of dismissal he had hidden in his ribs. That's how these three have been living here for years. Rini is a girl in a maid costume who thinks only of the eater. Pedrick is the only one with common sense in the dungeon and an expert at annoying the boss, and also the eater himself, an ancient monster that epitomizes laziness and disinterest. After discussing the fate of the weapons, all three sat down at the table again. Rennie asked the Lord what they should do with the rest of the profit sharing. At this point, Pedrick thought he had enough of this sword. The eater said with some indifference that they should do as they usually did. They could take as much as they needed and use the rest to lure the next adventurers inside. The girl clapped her hands and said that she would then personally handle the distribution of the profits. Pedrick thought sadly that the girl was going to be a slacker again. Suddenly, Rennie reminded them that they couldn't use special magic items. The girl suggested taking out the mana stones and selling them to make extra profit. The eater looked tiredly at his subordinate and said that was a pretty good idea. He then suggested that in that case he would go to the human village to sell the loot. These words alerted both monsters. They looked fearfully at their master and synchronously asked him to repeat what he had said. The guy was surprised at the reaction of his subordinates and asked what they were so surprised about. Pedrick said that it could be very dangerous and suggested to the boss to send Rini on this task. The girl was frightened by such an unexpected suggestion of her partner. The eater looked angrily at the skeleton and asked why he was so adamant about it. The monster replied that the Lord was still not good at turning into humans. The boy looked at the skeleton unhappily. Pedrick asked angrily, was he wrong about something? Deciding that the subordinate was right, the eater turned to Rini, saying that she should buy a lot of goodies then. After these words, the girl headed towards the village. For the first time in a long time, her foot stepped outside the dungeon. Looking around, the creature noted that the weather was quite lovely and pleasant today. Taking one last look around, Rennie remembered Mr. Eater again and mouthed that she would be back again soon. A while later, the girl reached the nearest feller's shop. The merchant looked with interest at the stones that the unknown girl handed him. Sometime later, he said in surprise that unfortunately, he could not buy back the crystals. Rennie became very angry at what she heard and asked what was wrong. The fence said he would explain everything by example. Then he bent down and started looking for something under the counter. A few seconds later, the merchant placed a glowing crystal on the girl's pepper. He explained that this mana stone was a rank B. For a commoner like him to redeem something like this, he would need to work hard for 10 years. Then the miser looked at what the girl had brought and noted that she had obtained much more valuable stones. Only court mages or high-ranking wizards from the tower could use them. The merchant hesitated and said that a jeweler who had an agreement with the royal family or a wing from the mage tower could match these stones. Renee realized that the capital was far away from here and asked the miser if she should go to the mage's tower with all this goodness. It confirmed her hunch. The girl gathered the stones into a bag. She didn't want to go there, but she was willing to do anything for Mr. Eater. Heading for the exit, Rini said goodbye to the merchant, who wished her a good journey. The bulky man then looked around the counter and saw a huge blue crystal lying on it. He picked up the artifact and shouted to the girl that she had forgotten one stone from him. The unknown turned around and said she appreciated the information she got from the man, and this crystal was left to him as a tip. The door slammed shut, and the pleased miser thought it was the strangest visitor he had had in a long time. But what surprised him most of all was that the girl noted that he was human. It didn't take long for Rini to reach her goal. Just before sunset, she finally arrived at the wing of the mage tower. At the entrance, the girl explained that she had come to sell mana stones. The mage in front of her advised Rennie to meet with the guildmaster to discuss the matter in detail. The cloth-clad man picked up the lantern and motioned for the girl to follow him to the head's office. Already at this point, Rennie realized that the building was built in such a way that the guildmaster was at the very top. As the ranking mage guided her through the corridors, the creature realized that human towers were similar to their dungeons in their own way. In front of Rainey sat a pleasant-looking woman dressed as a guildmaster. She greeted the traveler and thanked her for the long journey. The leader of the wing was called Gramit's Aimer. Then the woman stared at the traveler and asked her to introduce herself. The guildmaster's gaze alerted the monster. The creature thought that this person had an incredible supply of mana. The girl pulled her hood tighter and said her name was Ren. The guild leader explained that she initially wanted to ignore the visitor after hearing that some small child had come. However, the guard said that the girl had a lot of mana stones. Gramit's aimer looked warily at the visitor and said that the one must be well known to Wing. That was why the mage believed that Ren had brought high-quality mana stones that met their guild standards. After saying that, Rennie opened the bag and poured out a multitude of crystals on the table, saying that the woman could test them herself. Gramit's aimer stared in amazement at the incessant stream of stones, unable to believe that a child could get such a thing anywhere. In front of her lay a handful of not expensive rank A mana crystals at once. The woman took one of the stones and examined it closer. She realized that some of these artifacts were of the highest quality, close to being the best among such a rank. The guild master couldn't understand where the little girl got something like this from. Gramit's aimer looked at the visitor sitting across from her. By the looks of it, it was the most ordinary child. The woman asked sternly, "Where did the girl get all this?" Suddenly, a young stranger's hair caught the guild master's eye. The woman remembered that one of the 8 greatest imperial families had silver-colored hair. Did the daughter of this clan run away and secretly bring these jewels here? The sorceress realized that there was no other way for a normal child to have these untold riches. She grinned and thought that such a young lady probably didn't know anything about the world yet. Gramit's Amr apologized for being rude and explained that it was impossible to imagine that the goods could be so good. She also assured that her guild would like to purchase all of these mana stones. As payment, the enchantress offered 50 ounces of gold coins for each crystal and 80 for those in particularly good condition. After the price tag was announced, Rennie thought hard. It seemed to her that the payment for the crystals was very much underestimated. The words of the miser from the village came to the girl's mind. Then he said that a commoner like him would have to plow for 10 years to buy one stone like that. Through simple calculations, Rennie realized that each of the artifacts presented to her must be worth at least 100 ounces of gold. After realizing this, she looked angrily at her interlocutor and said that if this was a joke, the man would die. The frightened Gramit's aimer interrogated the visitor, saying that she hadn't heard the last phrase. However, the sorceress thought to herself that this young lady was more knowledgeable than she had realized. Hearing no reply, the guildmaster said that, truth be told, their guild didn't have enough money to buy everything even if they raised all their funds. But Rennie suddenly interrupted her interlocutor and said that then those could buy as many as they could. The woman swallowed and nodded her head. A while later, a chest of gold coins was placed in front of the monster. Gramit's aimer explained that there were 2,000 ounces. That was all the money the guild had. While the girl indifferently looked at the gold coins, the guildmaster offered to pay for the rest of the artifacts with items that equaled their value. Rennie asked if her interlocutor was sure that the items she was proposing would be valuable and in demand. Gramit's aimer replied that there was no need to worry about that. The girl replied that she agreed, and the guildmaster muttered that they should go to another room. Walking up the stairs, the wing leader explained that they normally didn't take strangers to this place, but the current situation would be considered an exception. At the very top of the tower was the guild's main storage room. It was rather empty for its size. The first thing the guildmaster showed the girl was a tiara adorned with 4th carat diamonds. There were small mana stones in the middle, so this item was useful for mages. Then a living black pearl appeared in front of the child's gaze, which gives a signal if poison appears near the owner. This artifact was made by alchemists. The last words made Rennie very wary. This ring was quite unusual. However, the girl did not want to get involved with alchemy under any circumstances. Seeing the visitor's displeased reaction, the guildmaster chuckled and realized that the young lady did not like the ring. Gramit's aimer replied that alchemy is an unhygienic field, and many people have an aversion to it. As the next option, the enchantress asked to draw Miss Wren's attention to the crystal heart. Smiling, the woman explained that the item was called Scarlet's Love Stone. This artifact could make the owner's love come true. What she heard made Rennie freeze in place and stare in amazement at the stone. Running the last words over and over in her head, the girl couldn't believe that she had finally found what she needed. Gramit's aimer went on to describe this artifact, saying that the owner only needs to pour mana into this stone in front of a loved one, and the spirit within the crystal will help achieve immortal love. The girl leaned closer to the artifact and asked, "Does it work on absolutely anyone?" The guildmaster assured her that she could vouch for it, putting her title on the line. The enchantress noted that the young lady seemed to have taken a liking to the artifact in question. Not holding back her emotions, Rennie shouted that she wanted that crystal. Suddenly, after these words, Gramit's Aimer thought for a very long time, which alerted the monster greatly. The guild master explained that this stone was completely different from the others. It could be used to steal even an emperor's heart, so its value was higher than the other artifacts. This information shook Rennie's confidence greatly. She was so close to realizing her dream. The creature thought hard. Gritting her teeth, she told the guildmaster that she could settle the matter. Pulling another item out from under her cloak, the girl explained, this could surely settle their argument. Gramit's Aimer looked nervously at the object. In a trembling voice, the woman asked the child where she had gotten the blade. The young lady would not answer the question and said she wanted that artifact for all the money she had been given earlier, and on top of that, a weapon. After the visitor left, one of the high-ranking wizards fearfully ran up to the guildmaster. He asked the whistling supervisor how she could give some child the gem. Gramit's Aimer replied that she did not see any problem with it. The guy with glasses shouted that the leader knew what this artifact was. Not calming down, he said that if he just gave this heart to the girl, she would surely die. The head of the organization took the approaching lens and asked, why should she care? Looking at the stones she received with interest, she said that some foolish aristocrat coveted this crystal and personally exchanged it. The wizard tried to object, but Gramit's Aimer shut him up and said they would have no problem. Once the crystal is released, that girl will die, and the man she likes will follow her. Therefore, no evidence will be left behind. The guild head grinned and said that she didn't know who that second lover was, but she definitely felt sorry for him. Meanwhile, Rini had arrived at one of the 7 dungeons of the great evil called Chachti's Castle. The woman standing behind her was skillfully waving a pair of scissors and a comb. When she took one of the hairs in her hands, she noted that the ends were dead. Rennie apologized to her friend for showing up so suddenly. She said she was in debt every time she came here. The red-haired woman said the girl didn't have to make excuses, because it was the norm for neighbors to help each other. It was the boss of Chachti's Castle named Elizabeth Bathory. Artificially wielding the scissors, she sighed and muttered that Rini's pretty face brought her happiness. Then she laughed and said that it didn't matter at all what she did with the girl's hair, as long as she still looked lovely. Taking another pair of scissors from the table, Elizabeth admitted that at times like this, she was very jealous that Rennie was a homunculus. She stroked her acquaintance and said that she still couldn't believe that her beautiful face wouldn't age at all. Also, Rini's face looks very young, and much paler than Elizabeth's own. When the haircut was finished, the owner of the castle ripped the cape off her client. She complained that the girl couldn't even imagine how much blood she had to spend to maintain her beauty. With an indifferent glance at the remains standing at the other end of the room, Rennie twiddled her foot and turned to Miss Bathory. The girl was embarrassed and asked her acquaintance what she thought of her. Looking at her co-worker, Elizabeth smiled and said that Rini was the most beautiful girl she had met in a while. She approached her friend from behind and, scrunching up her nose, assured her that no one would dare reject her. Elizabeth then asked in surprise, why did Rini even want to embellish herself? It was rather unexpected. After a short silence, Miss Bathory asked in surprise if the neighbor was going to confess to someone. The girl went to the mirror and looked down. In her hands was the very crystal heart she had bartered with the humans. Rennie then smiled and looked at her friend enthusiastically and said that she really wanted to do it. Elizabeth looked at the girl's frantic face in surprise. She then asked in amazement, is that really true? Miss Bathory shrieked that she had said all this in jest and asked the question, who was the lucky man? Rennie looked with loving eyes somewhere off to the side and replied that it was Mr. Eater. After hearing this, Elizabeth looked at her friend no less surprised. Then the vampiress shook herself. Grinning, she noted that the girl must be throwing around such heavy jokes because of being a homunculus. However, Rennie looked angrily at Miss Bathory and said that she wasn't joking at all and was going to confess her feelings to Mr. Eater. Elizabeth slapped her forehead and muttered that she didn't understand at all why the girl liked that bastard, adding that no one had even been able to determine his strength. Rennie contradicted her friend and said that it wasn't true at all. Eater-san really has a lot of strengths and can be relied on. An uncomprehending Elizabeth shouted that this type is so lazy that his laziness overrides all his reliability. The girl replied that she realized that he was huge and lazy, and that he ate like a pig and slept every day, wherever, whenever, and as much as he wanted. In addition, Mr. Eater snores terribly, is not very smart, and is quite voracious. Miss Bathory was surprised that her neighbor knew about all these flaws, but still loved the bastard. Rennie looked down sadly and replied that it was indeed true. Folding her arms, she smiled and enthusiastically said that she really loved him. Elizabeth patted her friend on the shoulder and said that she understood her attitude. The vampiress added that she still thought Rennie was too good for him. The hottie then winked at her neighbor and told her that if the type rejected her, she could come to her. After saying that, Rennie smiled and thanked Miss Bathory for the support she needed. Still clutching the crystal heart in her hands, the girl thought that she would definitely succeed. Meanwhile, the situation in the imperial capital of Riaz was extremely tense. An important meeting was being held at the headquarters of the Dungeon Raiders Union. The main agenda was the last trip to the core of the primordial universe. The reporter, who was one of the mages who had been in contact with Vern Hishutalt's warrior unit to the last, ended his report with a disappointing conclusion. According to their assumptions, the raiders had been destroyed. There was silence in the hall after these words. Suddenly, one of the council members jumped up from his seat and, slapping his hand on the table, shouted that it was impossible. Glaring angrily at the chairman, he asked, "Hadn't Vern Hishutalt's squad reported that they had managed to pass through the gate guards with ease?" At the same time, a clear sense of excitement began to be felt in the conference room. Someone remarked that the bodies had never been found, so it was impossible to say with certainty that all the fighters had died. Some confidently corroborated these statements, insisting that there was no way a man like Sir Vern would have died from the clutches of monsters. Listening to the incessant scolding, the council chairman covered his face with his hands. He realized that the primordial core was no ordinary dungeon. There were only two ways out of it, either kill everyone or be killed. However, it had been a full 2 days since the last squad sent there had contacted headquarters. All the laws of logic and common sense said only that Sir Vern Hishutalt had perished along with all 75 of his fighters. Nevertheless, there was still some hope in the hearts of the people. Realizing this, the chairman turned to the envoy, asking what then had become the family sword of the Hishutalts. After a brief pause, the mage explained that communication with the squad had broken down when they entered the heart of the core. Then he added that only if one re-entered that area could one get the 14th masterpiece back. This news shocked the entire council. Everyone present realized how serious the loss of Tanabella was. Someone called for a new group to be sent immediately to retrieve the sword. In response, another council member shouted that they couldn't do that since even Vern's unit had failed. To prevent possible casualties, they should surrender. Opponents of this idea argued that one couldn't just back out, as Sir Hishutalt must have fought a boss that must have taken a lot of damage. The adherents of the immediate action theory also backed up their words by saying that while they were talking, the boss was healing his wounds and reorganizing the dungeon. They believed that they should gather new forces and finish off the monsters as soon as possible. The solution to this issue had completely fallen apart on the chairman. He realized that humanity had already lost one of the 36 masterpieces and a warrior that the royal family valued. If they dressed up this time, there would definitely not be a third chance. Otherwise, if left as it is, the royal family, enraged by such losses, will turn their blades on the Raid Alliance. The main unresolved issue at the moment was the current state of the dungeon boss. No one could accurately predict how much damage Mr. Vern was able to inflict on this creature. In addition, the state of the dungeon after the raid was also unknown. Realizing that even a few consecutive attacks wouldn't be able to take the primordial core out of play, the chairman made a difficult decision. He affirmed that no further action on the dungeon was possible. Such an uncompromising response shocked most of the board members. Suddenly, footsteps were heard from the direction of the entrance. An unknown voice said in a mocking tone that all these arguments were very intriguing. However, I wondered why the council had decided in such a way. The chairman looked straight in front of him and saw a man in a cassock standing across from him. After examining the symbols on the unknown man's cloak, the old man was horrified. He asked, what had the academic community of royal mages forgotten here? The young guy who was clearly the leader of the invading squad of the Third Eye faction asked with a smile, was the council unaware of who was giving orders to their community? The chairman of the Raid Alliance was horrified. It was now clear that the royal family had already begun to interfere. Meanwhile, the young mage began to go around the round table where the council members were sitting. He said that the fact that they were here meant that the Raid Alliance would have to pay for its sins. The fellow looked at the old men with hatred and said that these fools were not only guilty of killing a precious warrior, but they had also lost the masterpiece that the emperor held so dear in the enemy's lair. In response, none of the council members uttered a word. Despite the obvious bias, everyone realized that they were indeed at fault. The magician then placed his hand on the shoulder of one of the bureaucrats and said that even if everyone here died, there would be no one to manage the countless imperial raiding parties. With a smile after looking around at everyone present, the guy said that they had found a solution. His organization had made a sound proposal to His Majesty that would help save the lives of the raid's Union Council members. He then looked into the chairman's eyes and said that they would head to the core of primordiality once again. The old man realized that this would not only affect Third Eye, but also his fighters. So he said that they could not succeed in a place where even Sir Vern had failed. However, the guy in the cassock at this point turned away from the Raid Alliance and, spreading his arms out to the sides, said one word, Nifrim. The council immediately began a panicked discussion of what had been said. No one could believe that the Third Eye would dare to do such a thing. The chairman looked at the lad questioningly and asked if he was referring to that troubled history. The wizard raised his hands again and with his head back up said that Nifrim was not a failure, but an undeniable success. Suddenly, he struck the table with the palm of his hand and, approaching the chairman, asked why Sir Vern and his troop could not get out of the dungeon alive. After all these rugged fellows were not weaklings and certainly not sloppy. Hearing no reply, the Third Eye member sat down on the table and explained that that was not the case. Then the problem of this defeat was something else. The main conclusion was that Sir Vern Hishatu and his squad were definitely missing something. The magician said that if these guys possessed just one thing, they could come back alive, and Nifrim is the one who has it. The wizard shouted that they would definitely make progress on this raid. Meanwhile, the eater was wandering around the caves and wouldn't stop sneezing. Looking around tiredly, the lad thought he sensed something ominous, as if a great disaster was looming over them. Then he sneezed with all his might, turning into a monster from the exertion. The eater realized he was sick. A while later, the guy struggled to keep moving through the corridors. He didn't feel like doing patrols, but he doesn't know when people might attack. So if he continued to procrastinate, Pedrick might scold him. Remembering his subordinate, the eater thought that this monster was too noisy for an ordinary bag of bones. Saying this phrase over and over again, the guy finally sank to the ground and almost fell asleep. Lest he fall into slumber, the monster rose to his feet, muttering that he couldn't waste any more energy on this. After analyzing the last fight, he thought that this time people came from the area near the dirt road. It might be worth going there now as well. A while later, the boy reached the 116 black tentacles. The monster was a pitiful sight now. Through the black mess, the eater saw his minion's eye. The boy looked sadly at the creature and thought that there was nothing he could do now. The only thing left to do was to wait for recovery. With that thought, he went to the next room. The main obstacle in the way of humans at this stage was Anthroporigo. Now this monster was also defeated. Eater jumped on the creature looking for its center. The peculiarity of this monster is that if it has a main body and nourishment, it will regenerate on its own. Seeing the eye still functioning in the core, the guy was convinced that the main body was still alive. Accordingly, there would be no need to interfere with the recovery process. Seeing its master, the monster closed its only eye and continued to rest. The boy turned around and jumped off the creature's carcass. Once on the ground, he thought, there was one problem after all. A huge hole gaped in front of him. A human raid had raised the first 4 rooms to the ground. Scratching his neck, the eater realized that this was something he should discuss with Pedrick, who would probably yell at him again. Thoughts of the many things to do ahead brought fatigue back upon the lad, and he yawned loudly. He stared blankly straight ahead and decided to think about the rest later. Surely he should rest now as well. Even though the guy had only checked out the dirt road and the 5th room, he thought he still did a good job. Turning around and heading toward the main den, the eater thought Pedrick would understand him. Suddenly, something glinted behind him. The monster thought that this was finally the end of the patrol, and at the same second, something flew past his ear. Before he knew it, an unusual dagger was stabbed into the wall in front of him. From nerves, the eater amplified his aura multiple times and looked askance at what was happening behind his back. Seeing the approaching boots, he thought, these human brats have had enough of him. The monster turned around and looked at the man. He shouted that anyone who steps beyond the threshold of this place may not think of escape. After a second, however, the boy stopped talking and looked at the approaching shadow in bewilderment. The unidentified intruder was Rennie. She began to apologize to Mr. Eater, justifying herself by saying that she had mistaken him for just another lowly human. The guy angrily asked the subordinate if it was her blade. The girl excitedly apologized to her boss once again. The eater said it was fine. not considering that he only jumped up in fright. However, it was something else that caught his attention the most. Rennie didn't look like herself at all right now. The boy noted that she had dressed up nicely. This sign of attention pleased the girl greatly, and she said enthusiastically that she was happy that Mr. Eater had noticed the change. Wanting to know the reason for this, the boy asked, "Had something special happened?" In the back of his mind, he hoped that Rennie hadn't decided to change her maid's uniform because she wanted to get out of here before Pedrick did. The girl confirmed the boss's speculation, saying that something special had indeed happened. Suddenly, she asked the gentleman if he could spare her a little time. Being very frightened, the boy agreed. He thought that he was ready to listen to any nonsense as long as it was not a petition for dismissal. Following Rennie, the eater found himself in one of the caves. The subordinate said she had brought the boy to her secret place. She offered the gentleman a comfortable seat here, while tea was prepared. The eater smiled, but still hoped that no one would ask him to leave. A while later, Rennie brought tea and poured the contents into the boss's cup. She said with a smile that before this place was known only to her, but now the guy was also privy to her secrets. With shaky hands, the eater brought the mug to his mouth and sipped. He knew this wasn't what he'd been called here for, and he was still worried that the topic of conversation wouldn't be dismissal. The girl asked the gentleman if he remembered that it had been a full 80 years since he had sheltered her here. The guy looked at his reflection in the tea and mouthed that this was one he wouldn't forget. At that time, raid sweeps gained a lot of popularity, and over 1,000 different dungeons fell. The number of people who had reached the primordial core had also exceeded all acceptable norms. That's when Rennie's status soared to unbelievable levels, and she even acquired her own nickname. Still drenched in sweat from excitement, the eater said he remembered that time perfectly well, and asked about his subordinate's right eye. Rennie squeezed her dress and was glad her boss hadn't forgotten about her eye. The guy grinned and replied that he would always remember the situation. In response, the girl said that she was happy to protect him then. The last phrase made the eater very wary. He looked fearfully at his subordinate. What she said last was very much like parting words. Rennie then looked confidently into her boss's eyes and turned to him. Mentally, the eater was tearing himself to pieces, praying that no one would ever ask him to be fired again. But suddenly, the girl said that she liked the Lord very much. These words threw the monster into a stupor. Looking at the fact that the boss couldn't come to his senses, Rennie repeated what she had just said. Clasping her hands together, she said she had waited all 80 years for this moment. The eater hesitantly tried to say something, but his suddenly grown tail prevented him from gathering his thoughts. Overcoming himself, the guy scratched his neck and thanked the girl for admitting it to him. However, he then reminded his subordinate, their lives are always in danger. The eater reminded her that they didn't know when they would suffer and die. He then asked the girl if she wanted to spend the rest of her days alone afterward. Rennie lowered her head sadly and said that it turned out just as she had envisioned. The creature said she knew it would be an onerous request. However, the girl admitted that she could no longer contain those words inside her. Rennie said she couldn't imagine Mr. Eater rejecting her and leaving. Suddenly, she pulled the crystal heart out of her back and mouthed that she was getting too scared to think about it like that. The boy examined the artifact in the beauty's hand in surprise. Rennie had said she'd always wanted Mr. Eater to love her, no matter what it took. Suddenly, with one swing of her leg, she tossed aside the table in front of them. After that, the girl looked angrily into the eyes of her lover and shouted that she was ready even to commit a low deed. The guy tried to calm her down, but it was clearly impossible to do so. Suddenly, Rennie held out an artifact to the Lord and said that with this, her wish could become a reality. But suddenly, the eater's eyes filled with incredible fright. The girl explained that it was only necessary to put a little magic into it. Suddenly, the eater's body gradually began to lose its human form. The guy shouted furiously, questioning his subordinate about what she had just done to him. Renee looked at what was happening, frightened, not understanding anything. Dark matter loomed over the poor girl. The eater asked, "Did the girl really want to kill him?" The frightened Rennie, looking around confusedly, did not hold the crystal with her trembling hands. Burning with a bright red light, the heart fell to the ground and shattered. The girl looked at the ground and couldn't believe her eyes. Barely holding back the coming tears, she tried to figure out what was going on. It seemed to her that there was an unknown entity looking directly at her from the shattered artifact. A while later, Pedrick saw that the boss had finally awakened. He shouted sarcastically that the Devourer was simply the best of the lot. Jumping around the dark creature, the skeleton exemplarily marveled that the boss didn't stop at just chasing the humans away. At the same time, he had kicked out Rini as well. After that, Pedrick went into a frenzy and shouted that he was in such shock that he couldn't even shut up. He explained that the Eater's power really didn't know the difference between friends and enemies. Realizing what had happened not too long ago, the monster asked his subordinate how he could fix it all. Skeleton said that it was the boss himself who arranged such a mess, so let him solve the problem. After a short pause, when Pedrick had calmed down a little, he said that still the blame did not lie entirely with the Lord. With those words, he crushed a piece of crystal heart picked up from the ground in his hand. Yet then the skeleton shouted out that the way the Lord had treated him was definitely his fault. The Eater pretended not to understand what he was talking about and said that he had forgotten all about it. Pedrick was furious and muttered that it looked like he was going to have to be reminded what it was all about. The skeleton reminded him that he was just nearby at the moment of highest insanity. Running up to the scene, Pedrick noticed that the gentleman was completely out of control, and in doing so, Rennie was in great danger. The skeleton realized that he didn't have much time left to stop the true monster from awakening. Running closer to the master, he grabbed the body by the head and asked the boss to stop. However, the boy's face was completely deformed. Pedrick realized that there had been a change in the Eater's perception of what was happening as well. The skeleton had no idea what had happened here. However, his attention was then drawn to the crying Rini. The girl sat on her knees and looked at her broken heart with frantic eyes. She kept repeating that she couldn't do it. Pedrick tried to shout to his partner and ask her to get away, leaving this fight for him. But the girl didn't hear him at all. Having no idea what had happened here, the skeleton nevertheless quickly realized that she was in no condition for his words to reach her. Reaching for his weapon with his hand, Pedrick decided that the girl would only be in his way now. With one sharp swing, he hit Rini and threw her back a few dozen meters. The girl wheezed in surprise, gradually coming to her senses. The skeleton apologized to his partner, saying that he saw no other option right now. After making sure that Rini had fallen far enough, Pedrick turned around and looked at his boss. Suddenly, the huge dark matter turned to a subordinate. The Eater asked, had the skeleton also come to kill him? While telling all this, Pedrick didn't keep grabbing his head time after time, causing awkward looks from his boss. Finishing his explanation, the skeleton asked, does the master not remember anything? The Eater covered his limb in shame and apologized to his subordinate. Pedrick patted the slumped boss and said it was good that he had come to his senses quickly. Still, the skeleton couldn't understand why the Lord acted like that. The Devourer asked if he should seek out Rennie. The henchman replied that the Lord was asking very trivial things. The guy admitted that he thought the skeleton would say the opposite, to which the subordinate replied that it was a shame, because it was Rini who was very important to the dungeon. This girl cooks the food and monitors the diet of the other monsters. She also cleans and restores the dungeon, heals creatures, and sets traps. Rennie also does consulting and solves each room's problems, sells treasures and distributes the proceeds, and keeps track of the ledger. Pedrick explained to his boss that the wench practically runs the dungeon proper, and her absence threatens their existence. The Eater said he understood that, though he was having a hard time accepting it. Skeleton kept urging his boss that finding Rini was simply necessary before it was too late. The monster explained that even if one had to bow to her, one would have to beg and grovel. While the Devourer was regaining his human form, Pedrick persisted, saying that he should kiss the girl's heels, only to return her under any circumstances. The skeleton then held out an object and said that if the master was going to go in search of a subordinate, he should take this. This artifact is called a Demura. This bracelet allows you to stabilize your mana. Pedrick said the guy shouldn't know anything except that this artifact is very expensive. The skeleton explained that the Lord's body was suffering due to the backflow of mana, so it was difficult to understand its effectiveness. Pointing out that the Eater once again had 6 fingers on his hand, the monster added that even if the effect was minimal, it should help to at least avoid unnecessary suspicion. The guy looked angrily at his subordinate and said that his willingness to do anything sometimes pissed him off. When asked where the skeleton had gotten the artifact, the monster said that he had picked it up on the way. Looking at the gentleman staring at the bracelet frantically, Pedrick asked him not to abuse the effect. Besides, this artifact is not strong enough. At this point, the guy interrupted the annoying subordinate, saying that he himself would realize the full effect while using it. Waving goodbye, he muttered that he was leaving the place in Pedrick's charge for the duration of his absence. The skeleton said irritably that the gentleman would be gone for a while. Lastly, the monster added that the boss needed to arrive back within the next 5 days. He predicted that people would be here in about that time frame. Eater said he'd try to manage as long as those raiding bastards got here. Pedrick ended by saying that no one knows what will happen if he fails to fight back and the humans get to that very spot. So the skeleton showed his 5 bony fingers and asked the Lord not to forget this deadline. The Eater said he heard everything perfectly. The next second, Pedrick shouted to the departing gentleman that he should beware of the villages and not draw attention to himself. After all, if people found out that they could transform, the dungeon would have additional problems. The guy glanced behind his back and said he wouldn't have a problem with that, and if he did, he'd just destroy everyone. After the gentleman left, Pedrick pulled a leaflet from his cloak. It was much worse than he had imagined. In no time at all, Rani was able to go and trade the brachycephalic tooth for a mana stone that had a demon hidden in it. Apparently, this caused the boss to go crazy and almost killed her. Skeleton realized that if the Eater found out what had happened, he would simply kill all the people he could find. Flipping through the pages of the newspaper, Pedrick thought that it was too early for humanity to lose. Suddenly, news unnoticed by him before caught his attention. When the monster read what was written on the page, there was no limit to his horror. The article had a headline in large print, stating that the headquarters of the Dungeon Raid Union was going to go on the attack against the core in 3 days. Just then, the information he had recently given his boss about the safe time limit of 5 days popped into the skeleton's head. The reading made Pedrick's skull crack even more. He realized that the situation he had created could be critical to the fate of the entire dungeon. Meanwhile, the Eater teleported to some abandoned area. Looking at the vortex his body had created, the guy looked around and thought that once again something had gone wrong for him. His second consecutive teleport attempt failed again, and here he was once again in some unbelievable place. At this point, he remembered Pedrick's admonition that the mana in his body was circulating chaotically, so using magic would be the wrong decision. The Eater looked at his hand. He wondered if magic was causing such chaos. The boy sprawled out on the ground again and thought he might as well try again. As an arrival point, he tried to set the coordinates where Rini had gone to sell the mana stones he had obtained. This place was Haston Village. A few seconds later, the dark matter transformed into a single stream that rushed into the sky with great speed. Meanwhile, in one of the dungeons, a majestic demon sat on a high throne. The female-faced monster was surprised that a troop of humans had come all the way here to die at her hand. The knight standing in front of the group of raiders grinned, surprised that such a low demon was acting so arrogant. As he readied his sword for battle, the man said that they were members of an elite squad ranked 32nd in the Imperial rankings. Pointing his blade towards the demon, he mouthed that his high-class warriors of the mercenary squad called the Yellow Dawn Tigers would deal with the monster without a second thought. The swordsman looked angrily at his opponent and said that they would make a name for themselves on this continent. And today, his boys would throw the bestiary off the undeserved throne. The monster looked emotionlessly at the fools and said that they were making a big mistake. Insert from her throne, the monster announced that she was the 17th heiress of the demon king Asmodeus. Amplifying her aura to a fighting state, the girl shouted out that her name was Melja de Lymph Agrea. She looked madly at the presumptuous humans and added that they were honored to hear that name and accept death at her hands. The leader standing in front of the squad got a little nervous, but immediately told his partners that he would do everything himself. After that, the guy took off lightning fast. He fearlessly lunged at the demon, screaming that he would make the creature swallow its own words. The monster turned sideways and began spinning his staff at breakneck speed. The raider realized that normal arrows would not damage the demoness under any circumstances. After the creature fought back, one of the mages asked the captain to leave the matter to him. Looking at these endless endeavors, the monster shouted that the pathetic humans, as usual, didn't know their limits. The monster swung its staff with incredible speed, creating a powerful magical flow. Purple flames rained down on the fighters behind the leader's back, toppling them onto their backs and burning them on the spot. The raider leader turned around fearfully and saw another stream heading in his direction. The guy reacted and quickly thrust his sword into the ground. Almost immediately, he drew his blade and swung it over his head. The slabs torn from the ground blocked the oncoming flames. The raider looked up confused and saw blue crystals flying past. He was surprised to see ice shards appear here. Looking straight ahead of him, the boy saw something that made him cringe. Above its head, the monster created something that looked like a bristling ice crystal. The adventurer could not believe that the creature had prepared a new spell so quickly. Automatically acting on practiced movements, the raider grabbed one of the slabs flying by. In the same second, he hurled a shard of plating at his opponent, screaming that he wouldn't let go of the monster so easily. Just then, the knight rushed swiftly in the direction of the demon. The monster split the gathered crystal into several individual shards and aimed them at the humanoid, shouting that the fool should not beg for death. However, the ice spears shattered with a crackling sound against the barrier the knight had suddenly created. Melya was surprised that this worm had time to react so quickly. Besides, it was highly questionable that the knight was able to create such a spell. However, the demon was sure that she had managed to get rid of the mage. Looking around the other end of the room, the monster couldn't believe its eyes. The other two members of the squad were struggling to stay on their feet. The mage, held by the gunner, was using spells with his staff. The demon was furious at what she saw. She focused the magic in the palm of her hand again, shouting that she hated those damned bugs. It was the second time since the start of the fight that the opponents had engaged in close combat. Suddenly, however, something sparkled brightly near the ceiling. Dozens of debris rushed to the ground in the same second, pinning down the fighting opponents. One of the stones flew into the knight's head and he was thrown aside. The demon also didn't expect anything like this. Stunned by the sudden blow, the monster fell backward. The eyes of both opponents were expressing a complete misunderstanding at that moment. The human and demon had a similar question in their minds. What was it? The debris created a huge cloud of dust. The silhouette of the unknown man was faintly visible in it. The other adventurers immediately ran up to the captain and helped him up. The leader asked his subordinates who was that. He also added that he had not heard that another raiding party was on its way here. Meanwhile, the monster on the other side of the dust cloud leaned uneasily on one of the debris. Melja de Lymphe. Agreya stared fearfully into the unknown. She was greatly surprised that there was another unit lurking here. If that was the case, then the human forces were strong enough to break into the Demon King's fortress. The situation was getting out of control. It was urgent to determine which enemy she was dealing with this time. Suddenly, the unknown man turned toward the raiders and called out to them. This strangely dressed man with a tired look asked if the adventurers knew where the village of Haston was. After these words, there was a dead silence. The people looked questioningly at the strange man who had appeared out of nowhere. The demon also devoured the strange weirdo with her gaze, completely unsure of what to expect from him. Suddenly, both opponents asked the same question. They didn't understand why a strange type was talking some heresy right after suddenly appearing and trashing everything here. While the Devourer scratched the back of his head, one of the adventurers said he'd better get away from this demoness. The guy looked at the shabby girl across from him, who was saying that she wouldn't lose even if there were more pathetic humans. That was when he realized how different she was from the older Demon Kings. That must have been the generation gap. Meanwhile, while the monster and the raiders were exchanging curses, one of the adventurers said that a support squad had arrived. The leader said that was great and suggested they attack together. The eater raised his hand and asked those present to pay attention to him first. However, no one heard him anymore. The boy tried to remind them that he was looking for Haston's village, but the people had already attacked the demon. While the eater was trying to get some information, the monster girl was screaming that people were talking too much and responding with her spells to the raiders' attacks. The debris of the building began to fly in the space around him. Realizing that he was unlikely to get anything out of these incompetents, the eater sat down sadly. With a frustrated look, the guy looked around at his surroundings and thought that he was getting pretty pissed off already. Then he looked thoughtfully around the ruined ceiling. He had to hurry and find Rini. Rising to his feet, the monster turned away, realizing that his talk would accomplish nothing. At this rate, Pedrick would kill him. Suddenly, one of the men called out to the stranger standing off to the side. However, the guy who was trying to think hard couldn't stand it and took his true form. A huge blob of dark matter appeared in place of his head and pounced on the terrified raiders. The knights and mages, who had never encountered anything like this before, screamed and cried like children before dying. The dark matter stunned and tortured them, tearing their bodies into small pieces. It seemed to the victims that the torment would last forever. Only a few seconds passed, and the eater's body took on its usual human form. Melja de Lymphe Agreya watched fearfully as the strange stranger swallowed up an entire squad of raiders in the blink of an eye. After that, the guy let out a loud burp, making the girl stiffen.
Pet the cat.